Welcome everybody. This is our live stream. I'm Robin. Welcome. I'm part of Radical Restart. This is our second ever live stream. So we're pretty new to this, but we're getting used to it and it's really fun. So this live stream, really happy to be inviting both Steph and Sarah here. In a second I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves to this live stream where we'll be talking about radical youth identity. So going into that understanding of what it means to be young, what it means to be a youth on top of that, and especially as youth activists who are looking at transformative change, what that might look like. So I'm part of Radical Restart. Very quickly introduce that. So Radical Restart is an organisation that's trying to bring together young people from across lots of different movements, especially the emergent movements that are happening at the moment, and start creating cross-movement, youth, special, whatever, interesting conversations that can start to spark a deeper understanding of what it means to be involved in youth activism at the moment, to be pushing for transformative change, to start really kind of curating a spirit within our activism, within our generation, that can lead to the kind of transformative things that we need. So Radical Restart, it's like a sharing, open, we describe it a bit like a cauldron. All these different cool people, like for example Steph and Sarah, come, they bring their own conversations, and then what comes from it is hopefully a deepening conversation across the youth movement, and especially looking at what it means right now with the COVID and the pandemic, and what it would mean to create a radical restart, and kind of what are we willing to do to make sure that that happens. Before we get into anything more, I'm going to hand over to, well, probably hand over to Sarah to introduce herself, because Steph is chumming down on that apple. Sarah, tell us a little about yourself.
So hi everyone, my name is Sarah. I am 22. I come from Colombia. I'm currently in London. Just finished my undergrad. I do a lot of work with Extinction Rebellion Youth Solidarity. We are a working group that, mainly does, I think, the coolest work in all of XR. We're a really cool bunch of people, and we work very strongly in kind of shifting, especially within youth, the climate change narrative, to stop making it kind of about emissions, which are obviously very important, but start making it about people. And kind of who are the people that have been fighting for nature for a very long time, what can we learn from them, how can we create ties of solidarity with that. And me personally, I'm very passionate about nature. My favorite color is green. I come from Colombia. I grew up in a very different culture. So for me, youth identity is always transnational because my identity is transnational. And I find that especially with young people, I'm having to make a lot of translations about identity in my head. So I'm interested, in this conversation and youth identity in the UK and internationally as well. And how can we link all of that together? That's kind of who I am. Yeah.
Amazing. Welcome, Sarah. Really great to have you here. I'll hand over to Steph, and you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, I'm Steph. I'm 23 now, and I was born in Lewisham and grown up in southeast England my whole life. My parents aren't from here. Surprise, surprise. They fall into like this diaspora community here. I'm currently doing my undergrad in medical engineering, and I'm doing a lot of work with Extinction Rebellion Youth Solidarity as well. Also Stand Up to Racism, and like XR unis within my university does a lot of lobbying there. So also my favorite color is blue. And I enjoy reading a lot, and just being in green spaces, of which I'm very blessed to be in. Lots. So
amazing. Thanks, Steph.
That's
and welcome. I
Didn't know we were doing favourite colours, but I'll go with yellow. Love a good yellow. And I'm based down in Bristol, 26, and I was doing a lot of work with XR and the XR Youth Solidarity, and now doing stuff with Radical Restart. So welcome everybody. That's us. We really want you to kind of interact as we go through. The idea is that we're going to be trying to aim for just under an hour or so with this live stream. We'll have 3 questions, which are kind of pre-ordered, and hopefully will spark some conversation. I'll pitch them to our guests, and then we'll kind of hopefully bounce off each other a little bit and go from there. And if you have anything direct to say, put it in the comments, and then at the end we'll have a question session, and I'll draw out some cool questions from the comments that we can bounce around for a bit. But yeah, aiming for about 50 minutes. Really great to have you with us. If you're new and you don't know much about this, get the link, share it around. Let's get some more people in this call. And welcome to the Radical Restart live stream. Okay, perfect. So let's get into question 1, and I'll pitch it to one of our guests. So question 1 is, what is youth identity? What do you see it as? And why might you describe it as radical? Who wants to jump in there? Sarah? Can I push you?
Yeah. So yeah, what is radical youth identity? Who has it? Who wants it? Who needs it? To me, radical youth identity is very much about, yeah, kind of because the tale of how our education system works, right? You're kind of made up to think that you will go through the system, and by the end you're going to be an adult, kind of thing. That being a youth is only in between space. Between being a full-fledged adult and being a dependent child. So it's that sense of transition. But what I think radical youth identity, so in that sense, within that framework, youth is only a transition space. You're not, as we say in Colombia, like, you're not a Coca-Cola and you're not a coffee. But if we start thinking about youth as an identity and not just as a space, then youth can become something quite different. And to me, what radical youth identity is when young people between 15 and 30, let's say, start understanding themselves as stakeholders within society, not just as people that have ideas that are outside of the norm, people that have different understandings of what the world looks like and what it should look like, more importantly. So in that sense, for me, radical youth identity is when young people get together, and because it's not even about being young. I think there are a lot of young people that act old. So it's more about an idea. Robin actually sent me a really cool article that I hope he might link in the chat, which is about the whole youth spirit and what that means. It's actually something that carries societies out in times of turmoil and in times of crisis. And I don't think there's a single person that's actually watching the news and reading stuff and actually knows anything that's happening and doesn't think that what we're going through as a society right now is absolute crisis in every aspect of it. So I would describe it as radical. I would describe youth as radical in that sense, as the group within society less willing to compromise in terms of ideals. To me, that's really important. More willing to dream and to actually use imagination in an effective way, not only as not an innovation, because that innovation is it's kind of different, but it doesn't change the system. So in that sense, like, being radical means changing the fundamental nature of something, which I think is really necessary during a crisis. But I'm going to stop there because I want to hear what Steph has to say.
Go on then, Steph. You've been brought into it.
So I agree. I think 15 to 30 is quite a good period, but I would even say even younger, because I think that okay, let me backtrack. So what does it mean to me, like radical youth identity? For like identity, I think there's a difference between how older people view young people and how young people view themselves, of course. And I think that radical youth identity is really kind of harnessing like this collective youth vision that you have. I know those sound like that sounded like so many buzzwords, but like there are things that youth get frustrated about that you can unite people, as we've seen with like Extinction Rebellion youth. We've seen the dynamics are very different when youth are leading things. We've seen like explosions of like school strikers and UKSCN, and students actually young people actually taking that agency back about what they want from the world. And you know, it's unfortunate that we have to be at like the tipping point of a climate crisis for them to be allowed to do that. But I think we really need to start visioning of what, you know, how much power the youth voice has, because it's not just a case of like, do you know how long they've been trying to get under, I think the voting age to be like from 16.
From 18 down to 16?
Onwards, yeah. Yeah, from 18 down to 16. And they don't even want that. Because they tell us that we're not old enough to make decisions about the world, when in reality, they just don't want the young, progressive voice to be heard. And you're actually, I think I read this from the like last elections, you're like almost 10 times more likely to vote Tory every 10 years older you get. So there's like, yeah, it's so weird. It's like there's a tipping point of about like 30 something where you're like, you're probably going to vote Tory from that point onwards. Yeah, so I think it's really interesting when you look at it as part of the like landscape like that. I don't know if that answers it. There's so much to say about this.
Yeah, there's so much to say, isn't there? No, I think yeah, I totally agree. And for anyone who hasn't, Google voting versus age in the UK. Like, for those of you who are joining us in the UK, which is probably most of you, we are like an age-based political society, and the graph looks like that. Totally insane, and we never talk about it. And I think that goes into some of the stuff we'll talk about later. So question 3 is all about intergenerational stuff. But I think for me, there's this conversation around youth, which is just, we just don't have it. We did a conversation again yesterday. We did a live stream about the education system, and we talked a little bit about why we maybe don't have these conversations so much. But I think every society has a tension between generations. Like, it's just understood that the attributes that young people are carrying, you know, idealism, risk-taking, they're willing to push boundaries, like a lot of emotions, these things cause turbulence, yeah? They cause change. And actually, all societies across the world are set up in a certain way to actually curb these a little bit. I would say our society takes that to an extreme with the way it destroys imagination, the way, like Sarah pointed out earlier, it basically tells you as a young person that you don't exist until you become an adult. But all societies do that because transformative change is scary, especially to the people in charge. And we live in a society with huge amounts of accumulated power, like tradition, all these different things that make it very resistant to change. And I think one of the things we're trying to get into here with youth identity is not to say that young people are amazing and adults suck. What we're trying to say is that adults suck at changing things in general, especially at a deep level, on like a transformative scale. And for young people, that's just like where they're at. That's what they want to do naturally, because that's the energy they're bringing in. That's the combination of being highly emotional and emotionally charged in combination with seeing the world, especially seeing the fucked up parts of the world, and just wanting to change them. And when we look at the current situation of the climate crisis, the health crisis, the societal crisis around wealth and all these kind of things, I think we just have to have the conversation of like, is it okay to have a society designed by adults for adults that isn't designed to change anymore? Yeah? And if we want our society to change, for me, we have to invest, truly invest in the imaginations, the creativity, the support of young people, because that's where the energy comes from for change. And that we need to transition from a society designed to stay the same to one designed to change and meet the challenges that are coming. And the only way of doing that is to massively change the picture that young people are presented with, whether that's critical dialogue, whether that's, financial support, all of these different things that we can talk about potentially again later in question 3 about how we do it. But yeah, just this shift, really. Like, youth is radical because youth represents energy and change. And that's why youth is always controlled as a part of society. Yeah. And right now, what we're advocating for, I suppose, is the freeing of youth to create the sorts of radical change we need. And I think that's a big part of why we're doing this activism. And hopefully that, I don't know, that's for me. What do you guys think? Yeah? That's the inherent radicalness of youth.
Yeah, I mean, what you're saying there is very much about creativity and who decides what gets created, because obviously creativity, or at least what I see within youth, is that the amount of creativity is almost, it's unbounded, but because we don't understand youth as an identity, but merely as a transitioning stage, then that creativity kind of gets, just put in the boxes that we all know just don't serve us as a society, because clearly things aren't working very well, and actually don't serve us as individuals either. As people, as actual human beings, they don't serve us either. So I think it's also like, as youth, we are the most radical because we have the least stakes in society. Like what you're talking about there, like the intergenerational change in voting, is because when most people, when they become adults, they vote with their pockets. They stop voting with their conscience in a way, which is, we have the least stakes to lose. Most of us, we have manageable levels of everything. We're not shackled into the system yet. We haven't been made to think that we are entirely dependent on the system as it is, so we're more willing to change it.
Yeah, definitely. Let's jump into the second question, because I think the point is to help the conversation going through it. And the second question is obviously really important, and it's, how do we create this identity? If what we're saying is that young people are about change making, about pushing things, about risk taking, about challenging the political order, about sticking it to the man, however you want to say it, that isn't necessarily what young people are doing right now. Yeah? Most young people, whether they've been smashed up by the capitalist system, by the education system, whatever, are spending most of their time on Instagram. And that's just like a fact, especially in the West, of our generation. It's very different around the world. So I think this question is, how do we create this identity as a generation, both in the UK and internationally? And obviously those are different things, and it might be cool to reflect on those. Do you want to think on that, Steph? How do you go about empowering young people?
So I think when you raised this question, I was just thinking about the ways in which the system or the ruling class uses media to kind of, like, they know that youth are impressionable as well. So presenting things in a way that will get them closer to the mold of the adult that they want them to be. So I think that's why, I don't know, a lot of youth have taken to using like Instagram, Twitter, etc., to kind of almost educate ourselves. We've been sharing, even over this period of time where, the Black Lives Matter movement has erupted, they've been, using Twitter and, finding our own, even within the frame of Twitter, Facebook, Instagram being owned by certain people, they still are using those platforms to kind of link their youth identity there. So I'm not answering the question at all. How do we create? Basically, when I was thinking about that, it's just like how I think that's one of the ways that we create it, is by kind of investing in that, knowing that youth have a different message they want to put out there. So even, I don't know, it's very hard to unite under the same thing. But I think overall, this transformative energy aligns quite to the left, and so it could be very engaging to I don't know, have a youth-driven for youth newspaper or some like newsletter of some sort where youth voices like amplified in that, and then can be shared and discussion can be had, because then you're strengthening the identity by building those connections. Yeah, that's it for now.
No, cool. Sarah, do you want to jump in there?
Yeah, no, I think, Steph, you're getting at something quite important, which is, where do we spend our time? Which spaces do we actually spend our time in? And it's mostly social media, or, well, not anymore because coronavirus, but in a classroom, or in some sort of educational institution, which is also to say the amount of resources that we have to organize ourselves as youth, because we have the spaces, we have the time, and we have the energy. So it's also like, look at all the people around you. If the visions kind of can come together, then we really are like important stakeholders in society, in the global society that we live in, right? But yeah, I think, how do we create this identity as a generation? I think it's also what actually makes up an identity. And for me, because I come from a literature background, identity is created through narrative, and it's created through telling ourselves something about who we are and what we want and why we want it. And if the narrative that can underpin a youth identity is about change, how powerful is that? And how important is that? Because the whole thing of identity is like, you have a set of preconceived ideas, but the whole identity of youth is dynamism and being willing to kind of tear down all of those ideas. So I think it's actually a trick question. So I think in the UK, it's also like, with all that creativity, it can be done through the arts, I personally think, through understanding each other as artistic people. Because through the arts, you have so many things. You have, imagination, but you also have the execution of it and kind of the structure needed to carry an artistic project out. I think that, understanding ourselves through music, for example, how important is that? And how it just manages to bring together a set of energies that can be quite interesting. Yeah,
I totally agree. And I think there's two things. One is what you're saying is like, how do we find the spaces that allow us to free the identity? And we did a live stream yesterday, for those who haven't seen it, about the education system. Go check it out, it's on our channel. And I think the education system is utterly key. Like, that's where most young people spend most of their time, and for some reason we don't see it as important. Like, teachers are literally raising every generation. You spend that much time in school, and to not see that as like, we're like, oh yeah, we came out of school and oh yeah, it was boring and didn't really get challenged, and it was, I got told off a lot, but that's just like what happens. When actually it's like, no, that's really important. So talking about those things, talking about how we can invest in media and how young people can create their own media. You see that massively at the moment. Like, Black Lives Matter has exploded partly on, as Steph said, like the back of young people speaking their shit on social media. And that's really cool. And especially referencing the kinds of histories we need to learn from, the resources, spreading all that kind of stuff. Like, we need to create our own spaces. But I think, as Sarah, you touched on a little bit there, the other conversation is just like, what is this identity? Like, we talked about it a little bit in the previous question, obviously, of like, what does it actually mean to try and be a radical young person, someone who's owning that identity of youth, if we're saying that that's the radical side of being young? And then how can we start creating spaces, for example, like we're trying to do with Radical Restart, to have those conversations, to get young people from lots of different backgrounds, lots of different movements, to start kind of checking each other, I think, a little bit. How you build kind of a demographic identity is that you need to come up with an idea of what you think it is, and then you kind of need to call people out a little bit on it. Like the feminist identity that arrived through the 60s and 70s in the US was coming from a load of, you know, absolutely incredible women, for example, who devise an identity of what they think a feminist woman is, and then they kind of called out loads of other women for saying you're not actually behind the idea of women's liberation. And I think there's a space here for us as young people to say, if this is as important as we're saying it is, yeah, if we've got like the literal survival of the human race, if we've got the level of violence that's on the line, all of these kind of things in society that are so fucked up, then we need to design for us an understanding of a youth identity that we think is transformative enough to take us somewhere. Obviously, it needs to change as we go. And we need to start telling other young people to get with the script.
Yeah.
And if what we're saying is that being a youth, a radical youth, doesn't mean only talking to adults and politicians and not talking to other young people,
Yeah.
then we need to start calling out that young people who are doing that and who are seen as the majority of youth politics, yeah? Youth politics has nothing to do with building a mass base of politicized youth. It has everything to do with politicians grabbing one or two tokenized young people and asking them to speak for all young people, yeah? And if we want to talk about radical youth identity, we need to get to the point where we can call those people out and be like, what are you doing?
Yeah.
Why are you giving power to the very people we're trying to fight that they're never going to believe you, and they're kind of just co-opting your struggle to benefit them?
Yeah.
And like have those conversations to like force, you know, kind of chip away at what this identity might be. And yeah, anyway, that's one of my thoughts about how we create this alongside all of the just like flourishing
Yeah.
of it. Steph, jump in.
I don't know. This has just come to my mind as you're explaining this. I think you're absolutely right about education system and how fundamentally flawed it is in terms of just having such a narrow box of what it expects us to be and become, and it tells us that we have to have it figured out from such a young age as well, creating all sorts of problems. But anyway, I was just trying to come on to the fact that, you know, when you're not in the classroom but you're at school, where are you? We're outside. It's something that's seen as freedom for us when we're in school, and I think it's very important to like realize I don't know, that doesn't go away, that just gets suppressed as you get older. And there's so much potential within the climate movement, because I don't know, I know that once you get to university, I've had conversations with people who are just completely disconnected from their connection to nature. But I think it's but as like young people who are still within school, that really coming together over those things could, you know, has been already quite powerful and is a space where like they can collectivize almost. But I think you're absolutely right about this whole co-opting. It happens even within the climate movement, where you're just tokenized, or, you know, it's only one type of youth that is being catered for. When you see all of these people saying, I'm doing this for my grandchild, you know, it's not good enough anymore, basically, because we're the ones who are going to be here. We're the ones who have stood up and fought when adults wouldn't. And I think that it's like, it's just very relevant. I think it's there's like a vacuum there for us to pull those things together, along with massively unfucking the education system. Excuse my French, sorry.
No, we're definitely not one of those live streams that doesn't allow swearing. Sarah, did you want to jump in again on that?
Yeah, maybe just what you guys are saying, I think to me what's becoming quite clear is that it's also about establishing the kind of relationships between youth that are able to sustain that work. Because I think, we all know that activism and being interested in changing things is actually not very easy most of the time. It's very time consuming, it's energy draining. And as you say, like, we do not go through life with the emotional education and like actually the personal education to be able to deal with the amount of turmoil and struggle and upheaval that we're living in right now. So I think in that sense, if by creating the youth identity as a generation, we are able to create the personal relationships to sustain how radical that identity is, then I think we're into something really important, to be honest.
Yeah, definitely. Totally agree. That like necessary resilience as we go into ever more turbulent times. And I think also, just the last thing I reflect before we go on to question 3 is that this has to be an international conversation.
Exactly.
Like from a bunch of different angles, yeah? Whether you're looking at it at the fact that the ecological crisis is an international problem, we have to, you know, or you look at it at, for example, if you want to fight capitalism, yeah? Capital is global when politics is local. How can we as a generation shift that and force global youth power into a, you know, the level where it can start to fight those kinds of systems?
Yeah.
But I think in that space, we just have to start talking. So the other day, for example, I called up a mate who we've been chatting with a bit from Nigeria and just had a conversation with him about what it means to be a youth activist in Nigeria. So like, what do young people there see? Who is it? How does it work? Is it radical? What's the politics that they're pushing? And just start to learn and build these relationships. And some of the interesting things he said was obviously very similar to here. It's like youth there is pretty much only within university. Because if you don't go to university, especially across lots of the majority world, you're suddenly an adult. Yeah? The like speed of growing up is infinitely quicker within those parts of the world which have been so basically fucked over and over again. Yeah? So you get like a very small group who are starting to think in this kind of rebellious, radical way at the universities. So it's like a slightly different dynamic. But also, you know, for example, in Nigeria, the average age of Nigeria is 18. The average age of the UK is 40.
Yeah.
Yeah? They have 130 million people under 25. That's insane. How do those different demographic changes like affect the way we think about youth internationally? How do we learn them? How do we get into it? But yeah, I think just making sure that as we build this identity, we're having these conversations internationally because we need to fight international problems on international fronts, and that means we need to build a generational identity that is, you know, international kind of vibe. Anyway, exciting. Question 3. Let's jump into it. Or Steph, do you want to go?
No. What identity did you just say?
An international youth identity?
Okay, cool. Sorry.
Question 3. So, with all of this, one of the things we notice when we start talking about youth and the radical edge of it is that, how do you say it? People of more experience of life, old people, get a bit annoyed often. So, question 3 is, what is or are the intergenerational conversations that are needed? Yeah? How can young people, so for example, this would be cool if you guys might even talk from your personal experience, however, but how can young people start talking to adults, whatever, be that teachers, lecturers, others, or to their family? Steph and Sarah have switched over. Sarah, can you turn your camera off and on? Perfect. Okay, yeah. So question 3, intergenerational conversation that's needed. How can we start talking to adults? How can we start talking to family? Who wants to jump in there? Sarah? Steph?
Did you just wait? Did Sarah want to go?
Go ahead, Steph.
Go on, Steph.
I think. Sarah, you can go first, actually. Sorry.
Cool. No worries. Yeah, I think that conversation to me means I see it as having so many layers, because obviously I don't know. Like I'm involved in the climate movement, specifically in XR, but for me, so much of it is also understanding that I want to change the world, and I want the world, like the world outside of me, to change dramatically. And for that to happen more and more, I am understanding in my experience that I also need to change as dramatically as the world around me. So in that sense, an intergenerational conversation with parents, for example, which is basically the core unit of our society, the core unit of how we are organized, how hierarchy is brought onto us from a very young age, and what that hierarchy is, and what those that you can have vastly different experiences of what that hierarchy and its impact is on you, then I think having that conversation with parents becomes deeply personal, and it becomes a way to have like a deeply personal engagement with, yeah, kind of what that means. How can that actually happen? I think it's very much in a sense of autonomy, like that sense of intergenerational conversation, because it's based on hierarchy. Do I need to? Okay, fine. Fixed? Yeah. Yeah, because it's based on hierarchy, then a really good way, I think, for me, or in my experience, has been of leveling. Kind of, okay, can we level right now? Can we step outside of our roles of who we are within this relationship and actually just, yeah, sit down and like have a conversation where I don't assume that you come from a certain point of view and you don't assume that I come from another point of view. So kind of leaving the roles behind, I think, is quite an interesting way of doing it, and that can be done in a variety of ways. I think for me at least, it's very much through like art, through talking about music, talking about books, and talking about those things, because yeah, from a more intellectualized perspective, which then becomes emotional, is quite useful for me. But I also think that there's a very interesting intergenerational conversation to be had, not necessarily with adults, but with the elderly, and why they're not elders. I think that demographic to me, or at least that shows that our system doesn't even work for adults, because our system only assumes that you are within working age. As soon, like if you are before, you don't matter. If you're after, you matter even less. And that's so much of what we're seeing right now with coronavirus, is at least is about that. Like young people have to, like the climate movement, for example, it has got to stop being about, I'm doing this for my kids, I'm doing this for my grandkids, I'm doing this for those that come after me. No, I'm doing it for my grandma. Because climate change is creating the conditions so that her quality of life is going to be detrimentally, is going to, yeah, just go to shit. I'm sorry. But I'm doing it for my grandma so that the rest of her life she can actually live in dignity, and not scared of catching a virus that was very clearly, which was created by human tampering with nature and by human, just loss of biodiversity. But yeah, so I think that's a second interesting conversation to be had there. Why are elderly not taken into account if what counts is experience?
Yeah, why have people been given sell-by dates or use-by dates when suddenly they get dumped off into a part of society that is what? Care homes, these different things. How has that broken down our ability to have community? And how can, totally agree, how can young people start having those conversations with elders? Just, I'm going to go to you in a second, Steph, because I know you want to say something. But just referencing this conversation we had a while ago with guy Jambi, who's an Aboriginal wisdom keeper from Australia. And he talked to us about the way in which Aboriginal Australians, or at least his peoples, see kind of aging. And they see it in this like circular point where you come down and you are closest to your like true self, and then you go through life. Yeah, and as you go through, and you especially go down the bottom, as you go through life, you accumulate these traumas that kind of seep into you and that trap you, and are the things that create pessimistic, rationalistic, whatever, like really just kind of get into your soul and make it really hard to connect with who you were. But young children, as well as old people, you know that thing, that beautiful thing. Not all old people. Obviously, you have those like CEOs who die on their beds still screaming about stock exchanges or whatever. But lots of old people have this bit in the last, especially once they've got grandchildren, others have this bit where they're just like, I'm alive again. All of that other stuff falls away, and they're suddenly just like out into the world. And we've been doing some work. Like, for example, here right now, I'm living with a retired doctor, and she's letting me live here for free because she's like, yeah, young people being radical, do it. Yeah, just like, I believe in you. And that's like such a powerful moment to have those kind of sharing conversations. And I think, while as young people we look for allies, we look for other people in society who share a similar point of view, who also, to be honest, feel a bit screwed over by adults and the current system. Talking to elders is like utterly important. And it brings that experience with the fire of youth. And I think it's just super important conversation to have. Do you want to jump in there, Steph? It might be interesting if you don't have to go there, but if there's if like a personal part of this, like, is it easy having these conversations?
Yeah, I'll go there.
Okay.
And also, I was just listening to you. I didn't actually have anything to say because my point is kind of related to that. So, yeah, I think what you both said is super important. Having those conversations between, like, that dynamic. But I think we aren't taught how to listen. We aren't taught how to listen properly in a way that makes you think about it after you've stopped having that conversation. And I think that the older you get, the harder it becomes as well, in the same way that you've just described about the trauma, making people get worn down by the system, and they get bitter, and we don't have adequate mental health care, we don't have adequate physical health care. So, these things do affect people, and it is almost deliberate by the powers that be, in a way, to keep people suppressed so that they don't keep questioning, so that they don't keep having those conversations and, linking up with youth, giving them free housing and stuff so that they can, dismantle the system. So part of it, I think, is us learning how to listen, without those preconceived notions, like Sarah said, which is difficult in and of itself. So there's that element to it, which is almost like psychological and a little bit spiritual, from my perspective. In the same way that you've also mentioned, linking with art and culture and being super important for having those discussions. But I think when I was talking about, like intergenerational trauma with some people from XR, and I think this is, like, I did not learn about this until this year. And I'm just thinking about how fucked the education system is, and it's like literally blowing my mind, because there's so many things that, like, why do they not even, after you leave school and everything that's wrong with the curriculum, with everything, why do they not listen to those voices after and input it back into the education system? No, because they don't want it to change. So, I don't think it's possible to reform it like that. And I'm sorry if that offends people, but there are spaces for youth to actually come up and say, this is what I want to learn about. Because what's the whole point of education if not to learn? Oh wait, no, sorry, it's for us to get a job so that we can keep inputting into the capitalist pockets. So, we're not taught how to have those conversations, so we have to teach ourselves. And I think exactly what you said about community building with elders, with people who have maybe got that experience and aren't pessimistic about things being able to change. Having those discussions can be super, like, liberating, but I think we also need to have those discussions with people that, like, once we have those discussions that almost feed us, we then also have to try and speak to people who don't quite get what the youth identity is, get that we want things to change in general, but we need that community and that collective solidarity backing to feel empowered enough to do that.
Yeah, totally. And I think the thing I would say in this is totally just feeding on what you said there at the end. And it's kind of hard to put it, but one of my missions at the moment is to work out how to create loads of intergenerational tension and conflict, basically. Because Sarah told about an article the other day and I've put it in the link in the live stream chat so you can have a gander. And it's done by some of the Kurdish revolutionaries around Rojava and other parts. And one of the things they say is that a society's ability to transform is directly proportional to the level of intergenerational tension. And this comes to what we were saying earlier, where you have this dynamic, just where, you know, there are different attributes that young people bring, that renewal of life, that bringing forward into a new set of adults, whatever. You have a different set of attributes here. And when there is no intergenerational tension, you see, what they say is that the society's ability to transform, the transformational dynamics, don't really exist or are massively weakened. And actually, the way you increase those is you start increasing intergenerational tension. And we see it right now as statues are pulled down by young people in Bristol and the old people who are clinging to, you know, we don't want to get individual blaming and shaming here, but like, you know, they're clinging to a notion of the world that involves entrenched white supremacy. Like, that's how they've grown up, that's how their world is shaped, and especially as people racialize as white, that's like a big part of, even if it's their subconscious identity. And I think when you see young people pull down a statue, or across the world they're beheading statues, or they're in the streets demanding change, you create an intergenerational conversation that forces change. But before that, you have a silent intergenerational conversation where we disagree with, like we said earlier about the voting differences, yeah? It's like those things exist, but we're not talking about them. You're not bringing the conflict, the tension into the light and forcing those conversations. And so I don't know if what I'm advocating for here is for everyone to just go and call out their racist grandparents. Obviously, if they're not racist, get in with them. We love elders. No, I'm joking. Steph's telling me off. But we have to start having conversations as empowered young people with adults where we start to stand in that power and say, no, we're not going to have a conversation which is predicated on the idea that you're right and I'm learning. We're going to have a conversation predicated on the idea that you're probably wrong and I'm coming with a new idea and we're going to fucking have a go at it. Yeah? And that's super important as we talk. But it isn't very easy. And for example, myself, and I'm sure Steph, Sarah, maybe one of you want to say like some of the difficulties you might have had even in Extinction Rebellion as parts of Extinction Rebellion youth. Oh, Steph's had a good face there. In having these kinds of conversations. Does anyone want to jump in? Otherwise, I've got an absolute stream of things. Go on, Steph.
There's so many things. I had something to say and I've a little bit forgotten, but basically, I think what you're saying is 100% right, because we all know that this world, not even just in the UK, but this world is becoming increasingly more polarized because of, like, that's how it's designed to be right now. Okay, that's how the algorithms work right now. And it's not made to drive change, as you've said. So how do we go about doing that? How do we learn how to do that? We have to look at... I'm so sorry.
Don't worry,
my phone was dying.
You're just called Sarah now. Oh no, you switched again.
Go.
Go.
Thank you, my love. So we have to learn from like where it's worked before with the intergenerational tension and where that's worked before. But I think just for me, like when I was hearing you talk about it, there have been so many times where you're absolutely right. It comes from a place of like, the older people will generally be like, no, you're too young, you don't understand. Or if you come showing them like some facts, they're like, no, let me show you this statistic instead. And I think a lot of that is it's how we've been told that we gain more value as we get older and we contribute more. So when you tell someone that, okay, now this young person who, you know, probably hasn't done the things that you've been told give you value, is very psychological. And I think a lot of it is, you know, takes a lot of overcoming ego to do that. And I think the only way to, you know, embolden youth enough that they have the strength to stand in that power is by having those communities, is by collectivizing, because otherwise you cannot do it. We simply do not have the strength to do it, because the system's been around for a long time. And yeah, so I think we really have to kind of do that. But what did you ask me, Robin?
Well, pretty much that is like, well, I asked you if there were some actual examples you wanted to bring forward.
So,
of times when it's difficult, and potentially even going into that conversation of how this is a different conversation for someone like me, you know, as a middle-class white hippie, than someone like yourself as, you know, like a diaspora young person, and there's some really interesting conversations in there.
Yeah, with regards to XR, like, personally, I'm lucky that I haven't had so many experiences of being told, you know, like, you don't have enough experience to do this, because I've purposely put myself in the youth part of it. But there is tension between the non-youth section of the movement, let's put it that way, to kind of just kind of submit to what they want to do, rather than, and there's a lot of tokenization within that, which is why I completely agree with what you said, that they just want a youth input from one person, and then that's meant to speak for a whole range of people, and it's just it's wrong, and it should be led by the youth voice. I think the example I want to give is just how difficult it can be when you're coming from, like, I'm Afro-Caribbean, and in African culture and in Caribbean culture, there's a lot of, you know, respecting your elders, and what people view as respect is different. Because for example, it's going to be quite personal actually, but at like about a young age in school, my dad told me that, like, I shouldn't study philosophy because it won't get me a job and it won't make me money. Yeah. And that was something I was really passionate about doing and really wanted to do. And so then I've had all these issues with struggling with my degree, and, you know, because I know that there's a conflict in my soul about what I want to be doing and what I am doing, and that I know that it doesn't drive me to just be wanting to make money. It does not drive me at all. And I think, this whole notion of telling children that they need to know what they're going to do from one age, and then you have to stick to it, you can't change it. And if you want to change it, then you have to pay however 27,000 and do another degree, because, you know, you listen to your careers guidance counselor or your dad, rather than listening to your own youth and your identity and what you felt was your identity. So that's my
No, cool. Thanks, Steph. Sarah, do you want to jump in?
I feel like quite a lot, because again, youth culture is radically different in different parts of the world, especially where I come from in Colombia. Youth culture is basically just violent protest. That is, it's the demonization of young people by the media and by the politicians, and as a way of saying they are destroying, and it's always about destruction of property, which I find incredibly telling of the kind of system that we live in. It's always about destruction of property. Just the sense of youth culture where I come from, it's about incredibly confrontational and very difficult to actually organize and mobilize behind that. So in that sense, it's, I would say it's just a demonization of the youth spirit. Because obviously Colombia is a country that has been structured around not moving the hierarchies of power that have been in place basically since the Spanish left. So in that sense, how that translates, for example, in my relationship with my mom, she is a single Latino mom. She is a person, she's an absolute, just machine, in kind of asserting herself in being a strong Latino woman, and actually what she had to go through in fighting the patriarchy, which is incredibly violent in Latin America, especially, how that translates in my relationship with her is sometimes when she will talk down to me, it's, wait, let's step away from this and realize the hierarchies that you have been oppressed by and the hierarchies that are oppressing my voice right now in our relationship now. So from in that sense, we have a very compartmentalized relationship where intellectually I think there's a lot of respect and obviously not equality, but I think there is a lot of respect and kind of willingness to learn, but emotionally not as much. And that's kind of what I'm trying to work with now, having graduated now, which I shouldn't have a degree in my hand to be able to say I'm actually quite autonomous right now, but it fucking helps, which it shouldn't. But yeah, so in that sense, it's kind of navigating that new relationship right now with how dependency also works. So in my personal experience, it's very much about understanding each other's struggles and understanding each other in the sense that if I lead with empathy, then it's more likely that she will follow with empathy. But if I lead with antagonization, it's less likely that that would happen. Having said that, I think that's for personal relationships. I think politically, we need to antagonize. I mean, politically.
But that's the tension, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do you live in a space where you understand what you need to do on a big scale, a political scale, but then when it comes to your real life, it's scary? Yeah. I think this is, again, one of those things that we have to just talk about a lot as young people and support each other in and protect each other in and all those kind of spaces so that young people can have these transformative conversations with the adults in their lives.
Yeah.
You two can switch over again. So that... Wait, I'll go on full screen so they can't see you in the wrong places. And just how we have those conversations, how we support each other, I think is utterly pivotal to our ability to create a youth movement. And there's things like, we should just be funding hundreds of young people to work full-time trying to cause a revolution right now. Yeah. That's just a thing we should be doing because young people are like our best bet at causing a transformation. And if we don't do that, then we're kind of fucked.
Yeah.
And the fact that those conversations are so hard to have, the fact that we have school strikers right now who are just terrified of what's happened and ready to work so hard, and yet their parents, so many of them are telling them they have to go to university, they have to get a job, and lots of them, because they're like whatever middle-class white kids, also have an inheritance that is going to be given to them in 2045, 2050. How is that useful when what they need is the funding right now in this kind of such a crucial decade that we're living in order to bring about change? So if we can, potentially one of the things I've been looking at and thinking about is how can we get to the point when young people can have the conversations with their parents where they say, like, I want my inheritance now. This is obviously, lots of young people don't have inheritances, and that's a whole nother conversation. Yeah, and that obviously we have to have it. But for the people who do, use that privilege, for example, and just be like, no, I don't need it in 20, 30 years if everything's gone to shit. I want to live with my values, with my integrity right now. I want to put that money that you're saving for me into what I'm doing. Obviously, I'm talking from a position where I potentially do have an inheritance to use. And then there's just so many amazing, exciting, interesting, and hard conversations to have around that about young people from so many different spaces. But what we're going to do now is we're going to go on to getting some questions from the audience because we're talking for a long time and we're loving it and it's all really good. So we've got one question in. If anyone else is there watching at the moment, throw some questions in. But I got one question from Meg. Don't know who this Meg person is, but I'm sure they're great. I'm joking. Meg works with us all the time. Anyway, so the question is, how do we not fall into the traps that previous generations have and hold on to this identity, especially considering how much privilege plays into the ability to take these risks. And I think that's talking a bit to the conversation that obviously I was voicing and we were voicing just then around which young people can do these things. But especially that thing, how do we not turn into another generation where people look back and are like, oh, I was so rebellious in my youth, or I remember those times when I wanted to change the world. Yeah. How do we not do that, and how can we make it actually different?
Yeah.
Any ideas?
I think
Yeah,
I'll jump right in. I think, yeah, I mean, I love that question because so much of what I think about, and the resentment, like the intergenerational resentment that I have, is like 68 had it. Like the 68 generation had it down, and they failed to see it through, actually. At least this might be incredibly idealistic, but I think a really good place to start with that is actually like, okay, this is about the work, but it's also about me, and it's also about you, and it's also about me creating the relationship with you, like creating the relationship that can actually sustain seeing it through, basically, because it's gonna be like an incredibly painful process at a societal level and on a personal level. So in that sense, yeah, when we're asking for youth autonomy, we're not asking just to do whatever we want, but we are asking to rely upon each other for the support to be able to do what we want. I think that's a fundamental shift to have. Like this is not about what I can do as a young person. This is how I can understand myself in relation to all of these other young people that are around me and that are working with me. So in that sense, yeah, that question is really good because it's also about what kind of youth is able to do this. It's a kind of youth that doesn't have to deal with trauma at the forefront of their experience. It's the kind of youth that is privileged in an emotional, material, and yeah, in those senses. So in that sense, how can the privileged youth understand itself in its position to other youth that might not be privileged, and understand that their voices are just as important, and kind of create the redistribution of resources that is able to kind of sustain that work. So in that sense, yeah, not only am I going to ask my parents to give me my inheritance right now, but actually I'm going to make it last. And I'm going to make it last because I know that there's another person that might not be getting that inheritance, and it has to be enough for both of us, kind of thing. So in that sense, redistributing our resources within youth, I think, would be a really good place to start, and understanding that relationships are emotional resources that we should be falling back into. And I don't want to be the feelings person, but I'm sorry. They're important.
I mean, I'm going to be the feelings person too. So,
yeah.
Agree, 100%. I mean, I don't have an inheritance, and I have never even had a conversation with my parents about anything like that. But I know that I still have a lot more privilege than youth in the majority of the countries where my parents come from. So I also have a responsibility, and I think that youth often feel that from such a young age, like that it's really important that there's a space created for them to be able to kind of, I don't know, there's a reason why the investment in like youth services is like one of the first things that gets cut under austerity measures, for example. But I think in response to Meg's question, which is a really dope question, thank you, Meg, just what Sarah said about this intergenerational, like approaching it from empathy is super, super important, because when you're a teenager, you're so angry. I'm not gonna lie, you're so angry, and you like knowing where to direct it is oftentimes really hard to figure out. So absolutely what you said about within your personal relationships and antagonizing politically, I think like for me, one of the things that helped stop me being like angry at my parents for not changing anything was understanding everything they had to go through before that, and that's very like very common for like diaspora youth. And I think I don't have the words. I think that it can be really healing to have those conversations with like within your family, even if you're not like Black or a person of color, or an ethnic minority in general. Like it's still really helpful for like in accessing that power that you have as youth, and realizing that once you know everything, that all of the obstacles that were created for your parents or the generation above you, you then, if you're approaching it from an empathetic position, you want to change that, and it will empower you. And then you can share this within your youth, whatever youth space is created. And that can be really, I think that can be really powerful. I don't know if that answered it.
Yeah, no, look at you two, so emotional. God, I can't compete. Obviously not, white man. But I'm trying, okay? I'm reading like bell hooks and other emotional books.
Them. I'm kidding.
But the thing I would say on this question, absolutely vital question, and actually it's one that I voiced a number of times when I was doing some stuff with Extinction Rebellion Youth. And it's about, you guys talked about like intergenerational trauma, but I think there's also just like the lived trauma that passes down between these generations right now. This isn't just like 100 years ago, this generation was involved in this and that's trickled down. It's like, I went to, for example, a big meeting full of like people setting strategy for Extinction Rebellion. And one of the things that we were very annoyed about, we're calling it like the youth burden, this understanding that the adults still think they need to save us rather than talking to us, even though we're not children anymore. When the climate movement started its vibe about saving the children, we're very much not those children anymore and are very capable and need this youth thing. And we said to them, like I said, I can see it in your eyes that you are pissed. You know, you are still hurting because when you were 18, when you were 20, when you were 23, and you had that fire inside you and you knew you could burn a new world, yeah? You could just do it. You were burning with it and you just got shut down. Like, that hurt exists so strongly in every generation that has failed to transform the world. And right now, that shows up most obviously when they turn around and they shove that shit down your throat and say that, no, I didn't get the chance to change the world, so you don't get that chance. Yeah? You see it so much in activism spaces, but you see it in lots of other spaces. Even like the education conversation. When you try and talk to adults about this, they're like, no, I went through that. Why would it... You know, this isn't the... We're not talking about the conscious level here. We're not talking about them thinking the... We're talking about like what's actually behind what they're saying. And they're like, no, I went through school. It was shit for me, but, you know, that's how life is. That's how life is that's always there at the background. And I think in terms of... For Meg, well, like that is the first thing. We just have to name it and we have to call adults out on it and say we don't get that option, yeah? We don't get the option to be another failed generation. This generation has to go places other generations have not. Otherwise, we're a failed species. And that's a whole bigger set of motivation. And I think that's the second point. It's just a different time. There's a quote by Siegfried Bauman who's like, you don't have 20th century solutions to 21st century problems. And I think it speaks bigger to that in that we have this idea that every generation kind of goes through the same thing.
Yeah.
Which is bollocks. We all live in utterly different times. I don't know what it's like to grow up with the Soviet Union existing. I don't know what it's like to grow up in Berlin with the wall there. These are just different things. Just like my parents don't actually know what it's like to grow up having conversations about the way the world is right now and its utter level of fuckery. Like it's just different. And so we have to hold on to that idea that this generation can be different, that we're forced into a corner. That means that we don't really have a choice and we have to be different. And we need to call adults out on the times when they insist that our generation needs to follow the path their generation trod. Because that's the whole conversation, is that we can't. We have to walk a radically new path. And so, yeah, call them out. They didn't like it very much when I did that. It was quite fun. Talking of intergenerational tension. So we've got one more question that's come in, which is saying, what would a united radical youth movement look like? And which is a big question.
Oh boy.
Yeah. We're talking about uniting a generation locally, globally.
Yeah.
What does that look like? What are we talking about? What are the big fights? I think that's the easiest way to think about it. What are the big things that we're going to be fighting against? What are some of the narratives that have to exist there? What have we got, team?
I don't know. I don't necessarily know what it would look like.
Yeah.
But it would, to me at least, it would feel very different from what there is now, which is young people just trying to do things in very, sometimes in very confined spaces of action, or what can feel like very confined spaces of action. So for me, a united youth voice, or a globally united youth identity, would be very much like opening that space for young people to be able to cross-pollinate movements and struggles in ways that are actually much more effective than if all of us just concentrate on the one thing that we're doing, because that's capitalist specialization. But so for me, it would feel much more free. But it also, to me, it would look like there's a lot of reparations and a lot of amends that need to be done between different groups within our global society that haven't been done by adults. So for me, what that united youth voice would look like would have at the forefront, a sense of, a really strong sense of where I stand in relation to someone else and what that means for that person and what that means for me. So in that sense, a united youth voice to me would very much look like reckoning with history and the history of harm that we have inherited for thousands of years, and the history of oppression that we've inherited from adults. It would also mean reckoning with the need for radical personal change to sustain societal change, kind of not understanding. I'm not trying to change the world of objects. There is no separation between me and the world of objects, which is so much of the issue that we have, for example, with this relationship between society and nature. The connection is just not there anymore, and that's why we're fucked. But if we manage to do that, if we manage to understand that if I work on myself equally as hard as I'm working on something else, then I might get somewhere. And because that requires so much work and so much effort and so much time, if I also invest in the relationships to keep that work going, then I think we're onto something big. So for me, that's what a united youth voice will look like across the world, kind of understanding where exactly it is that I'm coming from. And I think young people would be very good at that, because we do not have the arrogance of thinking that our own point of view is the best that there is. I mean,
we don't have the luxury of that arrogance.
Exactly. We don't have the luxury of that arrogance anymore. So humility and willingness to learn from other young people, I think, is going to be an incredibly important skill within what that would look like. It would just look fairer. It would just feel nicer. Yeah,
totally. Steph, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, no. Yeah. There's a reason why we're all being really feely about this, because it's important to do all of that healing work and those reparations and the things that are not conscious but like need to be addressed because they affect our realities. Which is why when I mentioned like the ego and stuff, like a lot of it is psychological and it's not stuff we're like taught about before we leave school. So it's, I don't know what it would look like either. It's very hard to picture. And I think that is the beauty of it, because we don't have to be able to picture something for us to like strive towards it as youth, you know? So I think just having that space where we're all kind of learning from one another, with the way that the world is balanced, I find it very difficult to imagine like how that would even be organized in a way that's more fair, as Sarah says, and that's, you know, feels like we're doing the right thing, feels like we're doing the thing that we need to be doing at this time. I think, was the question, what does it look like, or how do we get there?
It was, what would a united radical youth movement look like? So I think also reflecting on maybe what are the key fights that movement would need to take on.
Yeah.
I mean, capitalism. But I would say, sorry?
Your parents, your capitalistic parents.
Yeah, I mean, I think what Sarah's saying is super important, and I think we don't even talk about it enough within the like climate youth movement, but about like that personal work to be able to kind of, it's almost like you're saying, I want things to be radically different, but then you can't stay the same if you can't have something better without sacrificing what you have now in terms of the things that you hold on to right now. So in that sense, we would have to overthrow a lot of things that have led to the oppression and the unfairness that we see today. So obviously Black Lives Matter has created this whole discussion around what that would even look like, and we're starting to see it. You know, people are talking about defund the police, do this. What would it look like? We don't know, but we know that it's needed. So we're gonna imagine it and we're gonna create it but I think even that, you know, can easily be co-opted by the systems that are already there. So it's really difficult for me to even visualize it, because I know how insidious these systems are, but that doesn't stop us. That doesn't stop us from, you know, strengthening ourselves so that we're better able to visualize it and we're better able to combat it, which means understanding how it works. So, I don't know. I think I'm very biased, but I think a lot of solidarity work needs to be more centered around those global youth links. And I think it's something that we're going to be looking at more with XR Youth Solidarity, but broader than that, cross-pollination of movements, because it's where the generations have failed before us. It's where they failed, because without recognizing the interconnectedness of it all. So that cross-pollination has to be there, but it's about approaching the right people to create that, and it's difficult, but we're trying.
Yeah, totally. Cool answers. Meg's put in the chat that they were dope answers.
Thank you, Meg.
Big shout out to Meg. I think I would add, you know, there's just obvious things like a united youth movement that was really radical and transformative would not be very pale. Like, we live in a world that is, you know, 87% non-white. When you factor in aging populations, it's way over 90% of the world's young people are not white. That means if we've got radical international youth movements, we're looking at less than 1 in 10 people being whatever, looking like me. Like, I'm fighting for my spot. That's just part of the game. No, we're all fighting for it. Whatever. But like how that feels so far away when we still have international youth movements, like for example the school strikes, where they're able to literally crop out the only black girl who's hanging out with Greta Thunberg because there's only one. And how can we vision and imagine and have the conversations necessary to get to these spaces where the vision we have of a beautiful united youth movement across the world, across the UK, across different countries can be there? And how can we put in the effort to make sure that that happens? I think also we just need to think about it. So there's a quote we use a lot in Radical Restart, which is our favourite quote. And it's by Frantz Fanon, and it goes, "Every generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it.
Yeah.
And we as a generation just need to do that fucking work to discover our mission. And our movement, united youth, understanding, ethic, whatever you want to call it, that is shaped to fight this mission will be based on what we discover. Right now, one of the things that is being forced into the limelight is that you ain't getting anywhere if you aren't having serious conversations about white supremacy. Like I said, if we're saying more than 9 out of 10 young people in the world are not white, we ain't getting nowhere if we ain't defeating white supremacy along the way. Yeah? That's like, you have to factor these things in to any transformative education, any transformative movement. If we're also saying that the educational space is key to how societies globally now that the UN and the World Bank, whatever, are pushing Western education down everyone's throats, are key to the way in which young people are controlled. Their imagination is squashed, their understanding of entry into a capitalist system that is, you know, you have these set years, you're at school here, and then you have to go to university, and you panic massively if you lose a year in this process, and the amount of stress around that makes no sense is like fucked on a global level. So we have to do stuff about the education system. And young people across the world have been doing this for ages. And I think a big part of building this international solidarity is when young people, for example, in the UK, the US, whatever, in the global north, actually start having conversations about what a radical, youth-based, critical, use the word pedagogy, just means education, but fancy word, would look like, and we fucking start sticking it to our institutions to demand it happening. You know, there's already a movement about decolonizing education, but that needs to be education, not just a movement to create change. It's like, that's where we need to be, and we need to fight that battle on the streets with the young people of Chile who have been demanding educational change, with the young people of South Africa who have been demanding educational change. And that's when we start to imagine the sorts of possibilities that a united youth movement could give us. And then the kinds of educational practices, the kinds of ways young people can come into the world, can be raised, can be brought, can be invited with their beautiful, critical, imaginative minds into the world. So this question is so amazing, and we have to vision it. I totally reflect what Steph and Stare have said. It's like, it's really hard to imagine right now. But if every day we're working in ways that make it easier to imagine that are birthing the sorts of like radical youth imagination that make it clearer and clearer and clearer. If our mission is becoming clearer and our understanding that we cannot betray it this time, we have to fulfill this mission, then that's when united youth movements just take shape. They appear, they flourish, they come out of the woodwork, and the world changes. So anyway, I love young people. Big up the youth. All that kind of jazz. Cool. Are there any other questions coming in from the chat? Or is there anything you two would say? Otherwise, we'll sign off here. Keep it under the hour-and-a-half mark. We've been here a little while. For anyone who's stuck through the whole thing, absolute legends. Get this shared around. It'd be really cool to start a conversation around this. I mean, one of the things we said at one point was that we want to start having that like slightly tense conversation with other young people about what it means to be a youth right now. So share it around, get involved, find us on social media, join in this radical restart conversation, just like Steph and Sarah have. Bring the conversations you guys are having in your groups, you're having in your movements, and start cross-pollinating them. You know, bash up the view of a solidarity-based climate activist with a mental health activist from Northern Ireland. See what that looks like when young people really start rejecting individualism and accepting collectivism and just getting at it. But I'm going to hand over to both Steph and Sarah to have like a closing remark, whatever you want to say. If you want to, I don't know if you've got a book to plug or anything. No. Or just a quick sign off, and then we're done. Who wants to go first? Just a quick. Go on, Sarah. Don't. Just a quick sign off.
Yeah, sign off. Thank you so much for Radical Research for opening actually this space. I think so much of that is that like this is what radical restart means. It means having these conversations with different kinds of people. Looking forward to more of this. I think for a sign off as a youth person, I would say the amount of empowerment that is needed for the youth is really important, and no one is going to give us that. No sector of society will give us that. We have to build each other up. That's what I would say. We have to empower each other to think critically and to feel critically, more important, about these things. So yeah, no one's gonna give us the keys. We just need to tear the door down, to be honest. But we can do it together. Yeah.
I love that. Yeah. Thank you for this space as well. I think we know what things shouldn't look like. I think that we need to trust our guts, our collective guts as youth, about that, because, you know, the time for ignoring it has gone, has been and gone. So if it doesn't happen now, you know, you know, there's no other option to do this. And I think, just on the back of what Sarah's just said about empowerment, you know, you're absolutely right. They're not going to give it to us. But I think also we have to go deeper within ourselves about what empowers us as well. Just actually taking a second to reflect on that, and it not being about academics. Like, that's radical in and of itself as a youth in the UK, you know, from my perspective, obviously. But yeah, just do it. Just try and do it wherever you can. There's lots of resources. I can even send some through to Radical Restart. But please get involved with it, because we need to start. We need to get moving, you know. We need to let the cross-pollination like actually result in strengthening the movements, because at the, you know, there's time for the movement to actually trust one another. And I think once we're there, then we can dismantle many doors. So yeah. Thank you.
Yes, smash the doors down. Yeah, totally. I think, yeah, there's a quote by Che Guevara or something. Not that we like quoting old white, whatever, well, not white, Latin. All these, you know, old revolutionaries. Let's make some new revolutionaries. But he's had this cool quote, which is that the revolution is not an apple and does not fall from the tree. The revolution must be picked, must be taken. I think that goes so much to what Sarah's saying about these doors that are there. And I think the other thing that I would just say, I've always got this, is one of the things you'll notice as a young person getting into trying to promote change, trying to say you want things to be differently or done differently, is that adults turn around to you and they say, so, what should it look like? What does this world, what does this beautiful world you imagine look like? And I think what we've said, what we've talked about, is that we don't know yet, but we're just pushing in a direction that we want to be. But the other thing is, don't let anyone ever tell you that you can't be pissed about something just because you don't have a solution. Yeah? I always say this to people. If someone is punching you in the face, you do not need to come up with an alternative activity for them to do to tell them to stop. And right now, this world, whether we look at the education system, whether we look at the way, whatever, white supremacy, patriarchy is dealing with people, it is punching young people across the spectrum in the face. So just fucking stand up and say stop, and then we'll work out what we want to do after that. That's when we start having the real conversations like we're trying to do here about what comes next. But standing up, saying stop, that's the beginning. That's the power. We'll go from there. Amazing. Thank you so much, Steph. Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much for everyone who's watched. We'll catch you in the next one. Make sure you subscribe. Hit that bell if you want to. That's a thing people say on YouTube. And we'll see you soon.